Hi everyone, my name is Nikolas Timoshuk. I am CEO of UFuture Ukrainian holding company, and it is my pleasure and honor to be today here with you and be a moderator of another distinguished panel within the format of Insights of Kiev International Economic Forum. And today with me is truly distinguished panel of renowned economists and thinkers who will help us to explore a quite relevant yet big topic, which is an impact of COVID-19 and the corona crisis on Ukraine's economy. But before we get to that, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel. And I will start with Professor Willemm Buiter, who is a renowned international economist and a former chief economist at Citigroup. Professor Buiter, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Honored to be here.
Our second speaker is Mr. Oleg Ustenko, renowned Ukrainian economist and advisor to the current president of Ukraine, and also the member of the board of Blazer Foundation International. And our third speaker today is Viktor Halasyuk. Viktor, hello. Ukrainian economist, former member of the Ukrainian Parliament, and the president of the Ukrainian Association for the Club of Rome, PhD and associate fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Sciences. Viktor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, gentlemen, let's get to business, as they say. And the first question before we get to Ukraine and to all the nitty-gritty details of how are we doing in Ukraine in the global situation, I would like you to answer one blitz question, meaning that it will be same for all of you. And please try to time your answer to the question up to 3 minutes. And the question is, in your opinion, in your informed opinion rather, have we seen the worst of the current economic crisis already, or is the worst is still to come? As you have heard, probably, as we all know, there are different opinions, polarized opinions on this subject today in the world. The stock market tells us, or suggests rather, that it has been the shortest economic crisis on record, yet IMF, other founding institutions, and such visionaries as, say, Ray Dalio, are warning us about the worst, deepest crisis in the modern history. I would like to get each your opinion on that. And when you elaborate and explain your opinion, please try to suggest what, in your opinion, it means for Ukraine. Professor Buiter, I think we'll start with you.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that the answer to the question, have we seen the worst yet, is surrounded by massive uncertainty, because we've never seen anything like the COVID crisis. But my best guess, and that's all it is, an informed guess, which I made on the basis of evidence provided by experts, is that most countries have not yet seen the worst of it, because there has been a too early relaxation of anti-COVID measures. So we're likely to see a second wave. We haven't seen enough testing, either for antibodies or for the infection itself. We haven't seen enough contact tracing, and we haven't seen enough. In fact, we have seen a reduction in the isolation of contacts and counterparties. So it's not uniform. Some emerging markets, I think, haven't even seen the worst of the first wave yet. Brazil, India. Some advanced economies are about, I think, to experience the second wave. This is the US, which abandoned its, and its already late anti-COVID measures too soon. In Europe, the picture varies, but again, second wave is likely. For Ukraine, I think the external environment will remain hostile, and there is also a material risk of a second wave, especially because the testing levels have been extremely low. And we therefore have complete uncertainty about what is out there in terms of infections and antibodies. Thank you.
I see. Thank you, sir. Oleg, what about you? Do you think the worst is yet to come, or have we already passed it?
In my view, what we currently see is that not, the end of this crisis. And let me remind you that when we are talking about the current crisis, it's not just about COVID-19. It's also about the global economic crisis. That's why I insist that the Ukrainian economy and Ukraine as a country, as many other countries, are under two pressures. On one side, we have a pressure which is coming from the global economic crisis, and another pressure is coming from COVID-19. And in my view, COVID-19 was just a trigger which accelerated all this process in terms of the global economic crisis. So in my view, one more time, we are not in the middle. I mean, we are not at the end, we are somewhere in the middle. And several arguments. And I actually agree with the previous speaker that, the level of uncertainty is extremely high. And it's not just about strategies or any measures which are implemented by individual countries, but it's also about the global story. Look, when we saw that the crisis has gone already in China, we received a new portion of very negative information from China, which says that no, it's not definitely not the end. We already observed number of new cases, and these cases might be even worse compared with what we saw before, what we observed before. And then keep in mind, then when we are talking about China, we are talking about the second largest economy in the world. At the same time, the level of uncertainty in terms of what will happen in the United States of America is also extremely high. Number of cases, yes, it's lower now, on a daily basis, but who knows how it's going to be in the future. Are we expecting the second wave there? What will be the behavior of creditors and investors? What will be their attitude in terms, after the new information which is coming from their Black Lives Matter, Maidan, if I might say. So this is definitely, for me, is extremely important, center, which will produce, in my view, in the very nearest future, or might be producing some negative information which will be affecting all of us, in terms of the globe, in the world, the global economy. And one more time, the attitude of investors and the attitude of creditors might be changed very rapidly. So far, many of those who represented on emerging markets, they were trying to find a safe haven for them, and so far this safe haven was United States. But who knows what will happen in the future? In my view, all these developments which we are currently observing in the United States, including the fiscal deficit, the policy which is produced by Federal Reserve, so all these changes and information which is coming from the White House, from the Congress, from the Hill. This information is not. This information is adding to the high level of uncertainty, and this definitely will not help to anybody, including Ukraine. The same I might say about the EU, which is, also I mean, individually, EU as a whole,
Sure.
it's a second is a second place in the world in the international economy, and the situation there is again quite uncertain. Are we sure that the second wave is not going to come? In my view, the level of probability that the second wave will be coming in the EU is again very high. What will happen? I mean, I am very pessimistic about the situation in the EU. Maybe it's a little bit better than in the United States, but I'm definitely very pessimistic about their situation, including the struggles, which some signs or some signals are already coming. Look, some countries are unhappy with the financial support which is coming from the Brussels to another country, to their peer countries. So this struggle is going to be even, increasing. The level of unhappiness is going to increase within the EU as well. So in my view, yes, we are, coming through this crisis. And if we are coming through this crisis, and if this crisis is really the global crisis, then I doubt that we are going to move on a V-shaped trajectory. So in my view, it's very likely that we are going to see either the U-shape or we are going to see even L-shape crisis where, this...
Yes. Well, the stock market is likely to see the W, right? Because it's going to dip again. It's risen sharply, but it's going to dip again.
Right.
Thank you, Oleg. Thanks a lot. Victor,
you.
the same blitz question to you. What do you think? Have we seen the worst, or is worse yet to come?
Nicholas, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's my pleasure to contribute to the key insights. Concerning your question, I agree with Oleg that COVID-19 was not a reason, but the trigger for the global economic crisis. And I don't really believe that we have already reached the rock bottom of the crisis. I think we are just on the edge of the severe economic slowdown. And as you said, the IMF anticipates the worst economic fallouts in the Great Depression. And I see their point and share their concerns. Moreover, if you take a look at the patterns of previous economic collapses, I mean, Black Monday, 9/11, Great Recession, and so on, you will see that it took over a year to reach the bottom point. And the recovery lasted for several years at least. I don't see any reasons that this wouldn't be the case now. One may say that the indexes of the stock market have already recovered. It's kind of a paradoxical situation. But I think we should really dive deeper and look into the fundamentals. PMI indexes are quite low all over the world, maybe except for China. Employment has been heavily affected worldwide, and there is a huge unemployment even in the US. Many business activities are contracting. Some industries halted amid the coronacrisis, pandemic, and international lockdown. And actually, governments all over the world, they are trying to fuel their economies with financial injections. But this is kind of artificial buying growth. It works in short term, but this tactic is incredibly hard to sustain. And I think for Ukraine, it's a great challenge on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a number of new opportunities, but only if we create favorable conditions for attracting smart foreign direct investments, particularly into manufacturing, R&D, and other value-added industries. But we also can lose a lot if one is just going to rely on the invisible hand of a free market. I think we should be much more proactive. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Thanks. So let's get now to individual, more detailed questions, because I really would like to pick your informed minds on different aspects of what it means for the world and Ukraine. Professor Buiter, now it is a general fact that I think all economists observe that the global levels of public debt have risen sharply. Even in some of the OECD countries, Southern European countries, they are closing to me personally, staggering 200% to GDP. And what, in your opinion, are governments going to do to that level of debt after the crisis? Will we see some sort of a recalibration or change of international debt credit ratings? Is some portion, at least, of this debt doomed to be written off? Or will this bubble just blow during this second dip that we're all expecting here, at least participants of this distinguished panel? What is your opinion on that? And by the way, specifically about Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, currently has public debt below 50%. Some say it's good. Some say, though, it's bad because you cannot really reignite and boost your economy with that level of public debt. What do you think? What does it mean for Ukraine, the country's current level of public debt? Should we grow it? Should we be happy that it's relatively low now? Please.
Well, first, we don't just have unprecedentedly high public debt. We've also got very high private debt. And there has been already some migration of debt from the private sector to the public sector, and there will be significantly more of that. And I think in many emerging markets, and indeed in some advanced economies, Italy, Greece, a significant transfer of private debt to the public sector is not sustainable and will lead to public debt restructuring. Now, this is clearly more an emerging market problem. In the US, the holder of the only global reserve currency, serious global reserve currency, the debt is sustainable, and it would only be a political decision not to raise taxes or cut spending in the future, but to restructure the debt that could lead to a debt restructuring, public debt in the US, but same in Germany. So don't expect it there. But in fiscally weaker advanced economies, there is a material risk of debt restructuring. In emerging markets, including Ukraine, there is significant vulnerability. In Ukraine, you're right. In 2019, the public and publicly guaranteed debt was 50% of GDP, right? And it was actually, of course, in 2014, 85% of GDP. And the reason we knocked 35% of GDP off, a significant part of it was debt restructuring, the 15 billion debt restructuring in 2015. I do think that not being the owner of a global reserve currency, Ukraine is much more constrained in what it can do fiscally to traditional debt than most advanced economies. The IMF expects a 7.7% of GDP deficit for this year. Yeah. I think that is testing the patience of markets. 5.3% in 21, 3.5% in 22. Yes, it's possible. And according to the IMF scenario, the debt will not go above 65% of GDP, which is in principle sustainable, but this requires enormous self-discipline on behalf of the government and a more limited fiscal stimulus than may be politically desirable. So I see a material risk of public debt rising more than is currently part of the new program with the IMF, and getting us closer to a restructuring risk. It's avoidable, after all, because we just had that restructuring and the debt is not high by international standards, but the political pressures to make the debt excessive again will be hard to resist.
I see. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Oleg, the next question is to you. Speaking of Ukraine, I wouldn't break any news to you if I say that access to capital has been always a major impediment for any business working in Ukraine, right? Now, this whole corona crisis situation, has it changed something? Has it become better, at least in some perspective? Remained the same? Has become worse? And in general, what is your take on how can Ukraine finally break this vicious cycle of extremely difficult access to capital with stifling collaterals, high interest rates, or other conditions that prevent companies from taking enough debt on the one hand, but on the other hand, relatively high NPLs, non-performing loans in the Ukrainian banking sector, at least until 2014. It definitely has become better since then. So, access to capital in Ukraine now, during the crisis and after the crisis, how do you see it evolving now?
Look, this is simple on one hand, on the other hand is a very difficult question. By the way, let me please comment on what was previous speaker, William, was saying about the level of debts. In my view, actually, when we are talking about United States of America, then we have to keep in mind that in the United States, the level of public debt to GDP is more than 100%, if I'm not mistaken. Currently, is more than 100%.
The last figure I've seen was 186.
No, 186. Okay. I think that it's a little bit lower, but still extremely high, extremely high. The latest data which I saw was 110% to GDP. On the other hand, Professor very rightly pointed out that, look, that also is a huge problem within the EU. If you're taking a look on Italy, for example, then it's more than 150% to GDP. In general, in EU, the level of debt varies a lot, coming from 70% in so-called new EU member states, I mean, relatively new EU member states, to 170% as an example of Italy. In Japan, you can hardly even assume, but this country has debt to GDP ratio more than 200% to GDP. And then, of course, you have Ukraine, where the debt to GDP ratio is less than 60%, which is okay according to international standards. On the other hand, always keep in mind that the question, of course, is the ratio debt to GDP. On the other hand, another important question is how much you are paying for this debt in terms of the interest rate. And if United States is paying, let's say, less than 2%, then it's significantly lower than 2% for their debts. It means that they are spending, in terms of GDP, much lower portion of GDP to serve these debts compared with Ukraine. And in Ukraine, where we have 60% debt to our GDP, the average rate we are paying on the average interest we are paying on our debt is, let's say, somewhere around 7%, which means automatically 7 multiplied by 60% gives us a number much higher, 4.2% of our GDP, which means that we are paying more as a percentage of as a portion of our GDP for our 60% debt to GDP ratio compared with the United States, who are paying less than 4% of their GDP for the debt, which are 2 times higher than the level of debts we are having, relatively higher, which we are having here in Ukraine. So then, of course, then we come to the question not only about the debt to GDP and the debt as as a phenomena, but we are coming to the question of what can be done in order to decrease the level of this interest rate the individual country is paying for their existing debts. In my view, actually, the situation in Ukraine has been changing rapidly over the last, let's say, was very dynamic, positively dynamic over the last 12 months. Look, when the previous administration was on Bankovaya Street, the Minister of Finance was able to issue Eurobonds, which is our international debts. They were able to issue at a rate almost 10%. Almost 10%, 9.8%. This is exactly the interest rate or the coupon which was given during the latest placement of Ukrainian Eurobonds under the President Poroshenko. But then immediately, let's say even 2 weeks after new President Zelensky was already in his office on Bankovaya Street, the Minister of Finance, which did not change a lot at that time, you know, even the strategy was almost the same, was able to place Eurobonds at the rate of less than 5%. Actually, the interest rate was 4.75. Look, 2 times lower compared with the latest placement done during the Poroshenko time, 2 times cheaper placement. The same 2 weeks before the current COVID-19 crisis. During the COVID-19 crisis, 2 weeks before this lockdown, Ukraine was able to place Eurobonds at a rate of around 5%. So still 2 times lower compared with the level during the Poroshenko time. The same about the domestic bonds. Domestic bonds at the beginning of 2019 were placed in Ukraine at a rate of more than 18% per annum. Look, 18% per annum. And I am not even talking about the opportunity for many investors to get some extra gain because of the exchange rate. But the latest placement, which was done by the Ukrainian Minister of Finance during this COVID-19 crisis, was on a level of 10%, and we are talking about hryvnia. So in any case, the situation is very dynamic, but it's not just because of, I mean, the financial market is, again, a financial market comes with a high level of uncertainty as well, and the behavior of many creditors and investors is changing. However, I would argue that if the level of trust to Ukraine from the side of international investors will be at least on the same level where we are now. By the way, Moody's, did you see that the Moody's upgraded Ukraine 1 notch up a couple of days ago? But if it's still the same situation, I would argue that Ukraine will be able, if there is a need, and I think that there is a need, to come to international markets and to borrow at a rate, let's say, between 5 to 7%, still lower than it used to be during the course of 2018 or 2019 when we lived without COVID-19. But again, you know, many will depend from the scenario of development on international markets, including Europe and also United States. And by the way, if I may, I just want to say that I do not agree that when we observe the decrease in the level of our debt to GDP ratio, it happened not because of that haircut which was done, or restructuring of Eurobonds which was done by the previous administration, because Professor, we had at that time the size of our Eurobonds was 15 billion US dollars. But when we did this haircut by 20%, I mean, we were able to win only 3 billion. And by the way, my feeling is that, and my view is that it was the worst restructuring I could even imagine might happen anywhere, including Ukraine. But it was done already, so it's already history. But in general, I absolutely agree with you with all the points you were making. Yes, we are in the world of the high level of uncertainty, quite difficult to predict. Many things will depend on international environments. Yes, it's true. Ukraine has its own limitation, both to debt, to make new debt, and to serve already existing debts. In terms of the access to capital, I agree. Ukraine might be able to go to international market and borrow on international markets. In terms of NPL, which was asked by our moderator Nicholas, in my view, yes, it's a huge problem, but it's a little bit from the other, if I may say, it's another story. It's different story. Of course, it's related to macroeconomic stability, but it's definitely a little bit different story. If there is in it, I can comment later on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oleg. Thanks a lot. Victor, so after all that you have heard, in your opinion, what should be the key priorities of Ukraine's economy today amid the corona crisis? And in this context, do you think that the current Ukrainian government is getting it right or getting it wrong or both? Please elaborate on that.
Thank you. In my view, the first priority is to support the demand, both private and public. I mean, not only consumption, but also the investment demand. It's a good moment to build roads and bridges, to modernize utilities, to scale public procurements for municipal transport, helicopters, railway infrastructure as well. For that, we need to buy a lot of things, and we are fortunate to produce most of them locally. This is to be funded by public funds with the reasonable widening of the budget deficit, but foreign loans and partly even money emission can be used to cover that. The other priority is to attract private investments into the infrastructure and industry, both local and foreign. The government should provide very bold incentives to accomplish that. Something as powerful as it was done with the feed-in tariff for renewable energy generation, or with a 10-year ban for unprocessed wood export from Ukraine. This could include industrial parks, export credit agency, introducing local component consideration in public procurements, and so on. I mean, a comprehensive and powerful set of investment incentives and tools which is able to outweigh the risks we are facing now. What do I mean? That there are no good or bad times for investments. Conditions is what really matters. The role of government is to design good conditions to boost investment and business activities. And I'm not sure that Ukrainian government is proactive enough in setting these good conditions now. Let me put it like this. Thank you.
But can they afford it now, though, Victor? Because on the one hand, most of the people, definitely myself as a business person, would agree with that and would support that and would want that for Ukraine and in Ukraine. On the other hand, we see that international lenders, IMF in particular, are quite stringent when it comes to budget deficit, budget discipline, especially giving tax incentives of any kind in Ukraine. And maybe, Professor Bauer, you can also reflect on that after Victor, because I wonder what you have to say in that respect. So how do we balance that? We need to cover the deficit. We need to not break our agreements with the international lenders, first and foremost IMF, and then implement everything that you said, which, again, I think most of people would agree to. How do you see that possible?
Thank you, Nicholas. What I think that actually we have nothing to lose is if we talk about the automatic tax incentives for greenfield projects in manufacturing industry, with such a tool as industrial parks, for example. Because when I was a member of parliament, like 3 years ago, I met with a very high-level American official in the administration, and we've got a very fruitful discussion. And he asked me, what are the reasons why the Ministry of Finance, they are not supporting the idea of tax incentives for greenfield manufacturing facilities? And I elaborated on that, and the answer was, Victor, okay, tell your opponents, like Clinton told to Arafat, would you choose half of something or all of nothing? I think that is the case for Ukraine. Actually, we have nothing to lose. It's kind of option. If you just provide some strong tax incentives and other investment incentives for greenfield projects, as a government, you have nothing to lose. The best case that you attract billions of US dollars as an as an investments from different countries all over the world. The worst case, you got zero, because there is no risk for the existing tax base. I think that is the answer. It's about proficiency, it's about bold vision, and it's about political will. All the constraints, they can be overcome if there is a will and the vision how and why to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Professor Buiтерom, what's your take on that?
Well, it's important to recognize that A, there is some fiscal room, but B, there are limits and that are quite severe, because, for instance, the kind of monetization of fiscal stimulus that is routine now in the US, in the UK, just more this morning, and in the Eurozone, is simply not a realistic option for the Ukraine. But I think it's also very important that whatever fiscal stimulus measures are provided do not hurt the longer-term structural drivers of the growth potential of the Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine has had underperformance in terms of growth for 30 years. The share of investment, capital expenditure in GDP in 2019, before the COVID crisis, was not even 20% of GDP. Foreign direct investment, right, in 2018 was 1.9% of GDP. In 2019, it was 2.1% of GDP. That's a reflection of a poor business and investment climate in which potential investors are afraid to commit themselves because they fear that promises to them will be broken. Another example is the energy sector, specifically energy generation distribution. The country clearly needs massive investment in the distribution network. Right? The grid is in very poor shape. And this discourages investment in new energy sources, especially even renewable energy. And so I do hope that the right structural supply side incentive measures will not fall victim to politically easy fiscal stimulus measures. The regulatory asset base for power providers, right? Necessary principles of implementation are being violated even as we speak. Right? We should have the use of a single asset base, not divide assets into new and old assets. We should have the rate of return determined not by some arbitrary numbers, 1 for old assets, 15 for new assets, but by the weighted average cost of capital. So it's very important to me that the Ukraine gets this kind of supply side structural incentive measures right, and does not sacrifice them to a fiscal expansion, which in a limited extent is feasible.
I see. Sir, thank you. Now coming back to the points of growth, as you were saying, in your opinion, globally and in Ukraine, after the crisis, which industries, sectors will be thriving? And particularly speaking about Ukraine, if there are such sectors or industries, is there anything we can do now to actually use those opportunities? Are there any treasures hidden for us in this storm that we can use to actually come out better and make the most, the best of this crisis?
Well, clearly, you don't want to be exposed to a lot of so-called play industries, right? Travel, leisure, hospitality, where workers are in direct physical proximity either to each other or to customers. Ukraine is relatively well positioned once the cyclical changing element of this recession is over, right, to have a sectoral composition of output that is not unduly punished by the new global normal. Clearly, at the moment, exports of energy and industrial commodities have been hard hit, but that's cyclical, most of it, except with coal and possible other carbon-intensive industries, where environmentally friendly policies are likely to be adopted that are going to be permanent and will hurt the climate unfriendly industries and encourage the environmentally sustainable industries. There will be probably some increase in economic nationalism and reduction in that globalization, but I do think that Ukraine is reasonably well positioned since its export structure is concentrated on industrial supplies, including mining, mostly iron, and food, right? So unless there is a major and lasting reduction in globalization and an aggressive pursuit of self-sufficiency, these sectors should do reasonably well in the recovery. But again, supply side and incentives, structural measures are key. So we must make sure that the right regulatory incentives for investment, both in, for instance, the electric grid, other infrastructure industries, and in renewable power generally, that the positive measures that were taken prior to 2019 are not undone by a worsening of the regulatory distribution system operation tariff methodology. The regulatory asset base, right, needs refining in ways that makes people want to invest even when costs normalize. And Ukraine has a poor track record in that, and I hope that it will not make the same mistakes again that they made in previous recoveries.
Thank you. Thank you for your opinion, sir. Oleg, now the question is to you. You definitely have a quite comprehensive picture on Ukraine. In your opinion, why should anyone invest in Ukraine now or after the corona crisis? What industries might attract investors today or tomorrow, and why? Please elaborate.
Let me please also comment on the previous question as well. So in my view, we have always to keep in mind that there are two horizons when we are talking about economic growth. We might be talking about the short-term economic growth and the measures for this short economic growth, for accelerating economic growth in the short period of time. might be different, especially for the countries such as Ukraine, might be very different from those which should be employed when we are talking about their longer-term prospects. In this sense, I completely agree with the vision that for the long-term economic growth, for emerging markets as a global and for Ukraine as per individual country, might be coming only from the side of investment. Keeping in mind that always over the last 30 years, basically in our modern economic history, we were underinvested by all means. And I always use the example of Turkey and Ukraine. In 1991, Turkey and Ukraine, almost the same number of people, around 50 million people in Turkey and around 50 million people in Ukraine. During the 30-year period, almost 30-year period of time, the GDP of Turkey is around, I forget to mention, but the GDP was almost the same, 70 billion in one country and 70 billion in the other country. In 30 years, the GDP of Turkey is almost 1 trillion, lower than that, but almost 1 trillion. 700. Yeah, but Ukraine, look, our latest number coming from last year is around 150. So, and we are talking, in modern dollars. Still, 70 billion in 1991 was completely different money compared with 150 now. Look, during this period of time from 1991 to the end of 2018, the global economy doubled. The global economy doubled, while Ukrainian economy, as was already mentioned very lightly by William, still lower from compared with the point when we started our new economic journey. We are 20 percentage points below compared with the level of 1991. And that's why, the number of people, the number of population in Ukraine so far is around 40 million, while the number of population in Turkey is more than 70 million. So basically, they also doubled the number of their population while we were shrinking so dramatically. So in my view, no other way to improve the situation in Ukraine, as in many other emerging market countries, is just trying to attract more and more investments. Not only foreign direct investments, also investments. Investments per se. This is crucially important. For that, obviously, you need to improve business climate. But also, please keep in mind that the world is not about, it's not just Ukraine, and it's not about Ukraine. It's about everybody, and everybody in this world understands that FDIs, as any other investments, are extremely important. This is really something which give you something into your hands, which can stimulate economic growth, which can produce, tremendous changes in your country for population, which are so needed by the population, to the population. So from this point of view, the competition for these investments are dramatically increasing. So that's why, it's not just the case for Ukraine that you have to improve the business climate in the country. You have to improve your business climate at a speed higher than the speed of others, of your competitors. This is extremely important. Otherwise, you are going to be improving your business climate, but still the inflow of FDIs, of investments into your country is going to be still on a very, very, very low level. This is a important thing. Yes.
May I say one thing here? I think it is very sad that the 5 billion deal with the IMF that was just agreed, right, went easy, went light on domestic structural reforms needed by Ukraine because of the large waves of COVID-related pandemic depression hitting the country. So we have very little in terms of conditions for structural reforms. And we could really do a lot better, I think, in this country. Incentive tariff setting, incentive regulation, RAB regulation. It would increase tax revenues, it wouldn't hurt them. It would increase investment in the grid, very necessary. And it could even increase state revenues for privatization. If the state finally gets out of the electricity generation and distribution business. So it is unfortunate that this opportunity for reform, which came from the IMF support conditionality, has to a significant extent been missed because of the pressure of doing something immediately of the COVID crisis. Sorry,
No.
Victor, may I then redirect a question to you? Now, with all this, what Oleg and Professor Bauer said, do you think that Ukrainian business has any competitive advantage now in Ukraine or internationally? And what can we do? What can or must Ukraine do to really strengthen its global competitiveness of its private sector, first and foremost?
Interesting question. I think this key assets of the Ukrainian business is flexibility and creativity, first of all. One should be very adaptive, creative, and efficient to do well in such a challenging business environment in the emerging market as ours. What can Ukraine do to strengthen the competitiveness of the private sector? Well, I think Ukraine should really improve economic conditions for new entrants and attract a lot of new investors into manufacturing, R&D, and other high-valued industries. As to me, that's the key. More investment, more competition, more jobs, more economic activity, more prosperity. Mm-hmm. And the tools are basically very simple. Look at the feed-in tariff for renewables. It worked perfectly to the point and attracted multi-billion investments into Ukraine.
10 billion investment.
Absolutely. It's a big success story for Ukraine, and it's a quite recent history. Look at the 10-year ban for the timber export from Ukraine, which we introduced when I was a member of the parliament a few years ago. It worked very well. It almost doubled the wood processing and furniture industries in Ukraine with the help of the international investors as well and local ones as well. And all of these were done by private investments, which resulted from the timber export ban. So there is only one way, basically. Government improves economic conditions and makes a business case for investors. Then private investors come and invest. They earn their profits, and country and people benefit as well. This is how it works. And I do agree with Oleg that the task, the goal should be very bold and very ambitious. We cannot just slightly improve economic conditions or business case for investors. We should perform kind of radical transformation in order to be super beneficial for the investors to come. But we see a number of successful cases in Ukraine. Why shouldn't we scale the success stories and replicate them in different industries? It is the role of the government to set rule of games. It is the role of the private investors to come, invest, earn their profits. And I think it's very important that we have aligned the interest of the investors and the interest of the public interest, the interest of the people of Ukraine. And it's quite possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks a lot. Now, gentlemen, since we're literally right out of time, I want to ask the last blitz question to you all. It's a bit provocative one, but it's very relevant, unfortunately, today in the world. Now, we have all seen that not just roles of government, because of the pandemic and coronavirus, have increased, but in general, over the last years, so to speak, moods and intentions of different governments, different countries towards nationalization, towards more of a protectionist, domestically oriented policy really increased for a number of reasons. Even such huge countries and liberal countries as the United States, they also are moving more and more towards their protectionist agenda. Now, how does Ukraine balance its aspirations of further integration into European and international community, and at the same time protecting its economy and supporting its business in a balanced way, in a way that would not disintegrate us from the international community, yet allow necessary support for the domestic economy, both public and private sectors? Professor Bauer, question to you first.
Well, I believe that Ukraine has enough strong or potentially strong sectors, starting from the traditional ones like agriculture, mining, but looking, in fact, already at, we've been seeing it in the last few years, at high-tech industries and more tech-savvy versions of traditional industries. So I do not think that, for instance, protectionist measures are likely to be necessary. If certain industries need support, right, I would do it explicitly through the tax transfer mechanism. And that is transparent, and you can then withdraw it when it has served its purpose. But very important is to get the right tax incentives and the right regulatory incentives for people to invest in these industries. Right? Yes, renewable energy investment boomed, right? But it's still only renewable energy, 8% of the total supply of energy. Right? So there's a lot more room. And the incentives, which were all in favor of investing in renewable energy sectors, the FIT, have been damaged by a backtracking on earlier commitments. You cannot, I think, backtrack on commitments to tariffs or to tax treatments and hope to continue to attract capital expenditure from abroad or domestically. But yes, I think Ukraine, its geographic location is great, right? I mean, you look west, you have an enormous market. Turkey is a potentially very powerful market. Even if common sense and peace ever break out with Russia, that could become, in certain selected industries, a more important market. I think Ukraine is a country, partly because of its decades of underperformance, of unparalleled potential, but it needs the right regulatory and tax and incentive environment, as well as incentives to get the infrastructure up to 21st century standards. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Oleg, the same question to you. How do you think we can or should balance?
Look, again, in my view, we have to divide very clearly between the short-term perspectives and the longer-term perspectives. In my view, it's very hard, really very hard, to be crystally virgin when your neighbors are playing other games. And I am not talking about neighbors, geographical neighbors, but neighbors in the world. I mean, I could not insist that we have to keep out of any protectionist measures in a short period of time, while others are employing these measures very aggressively. it comes to my mind the experience of United States over the last months, the experience of some EU countries. Even there, I would say that the struggle, which is already inside the EU in terms of the free market regime. So in my view, you are not able to be absolutely crystal virgin in this sense of not employing any protectionist measures while others are doing the same. So in my view, some industries, and it's hard, it's hard for me to say that, but I would not argue that this is a mistake to employ some of that measures for a short period of time for some Ukrainian industries, but one more time, for very short period of time. And of course, I remember the case of so-called infant industry status, which was given, for example, for Ukrainian automakers when Ukraine was entering WTO, and it didn't work at all because people just did not invest into their companies and they just lost or at this time for nothing. But nevertheless, I think that for some period of time it might be working, but you have to be very, very, very transparent. You have to be very, open in terms of where and for which period of time you are going to introduce some extra protection for your for some industries. And also, I don't mind, if you are going to introduce some extra incentives for local producers when we are talking about public procurement. I do realize that there is, of course, the back effect. I do realize that. That's why I am arguing that it should be done in a very transparent manner and then for very short period of time, just to make sure that we are coming back on this, sustainable, not coming back, but coming to the sustainable growth trajectory.
Very sorry for interrupting, just very short time, and Professor Bauer will have to leave in a couple of minutes. Victor, so the same question to you as shortly as you can, please.
Very good question. By the way, if you just take a look at the GDP per capita figures in Ukraine and the European Union, you will see a strong divergence trend. It means that despite we Ukrainians are Europeans, there is no true Euro integration of Ukraine in economic terms. But in spite of this, I don't think that we should protect our economy literally. I would prefer creating favorable conditions for investors to come. As I already said, with the strong focus on manufacturing, R&D, energy efficiency, infrastructure, and other high-valued activities. But there are different kinds of investments. Of course, we should not in no way support commodity export or plain financial speculations. That is just the other universe, so to say. What should we do is to introduce strong investment incentives, and liberal doesn't mean stupid. Look at the US. They have got a Buy American Act since 1933, and it is operative now as a federal legislation. Look at their restriction on timber export, which is operative since 1926, and it is currently in place. So we just should learn very fast and introduce these best pieces of the best international practice. And as I already told, we should try to simultaneously align business interests with the public interest. This would be the win-win game and the true Euro integration perspective for Ukraine. Thank you.
Victor, thank you. Thank you. I have said it better. Liberal doesn't mean stupid. Thank you, gentlemen. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you very much for this panel, for sparing time and your insights. I wish we could have done it longer, but I know you are very busy. Professor Bauer, Olegom Ustенko, Viktor Halasuk, thank you very much, and I hope to see you
very much
online with Kyiv International Economic Forum again. Have a nice day, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Kiev. See you.
Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we're done. Professor Bauer, thank you once again. You can switch off. I know you have to run. I appreciate your time.
I had another meeting. It was a pleasure and an honor to be such a distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Oleg,